Welcome to today's episode of our exploration into one of humanity's greatest mysteries. Picture this. Beneath the waves of our modern oceans lie entire continents, vast grasslands, dense forests, and river valleys that once teemed with life. These aren't the lost cities of legend or myth. These are real places where your ancestors walked, hunted, loved, and survived. They crossed bridges of land that connected continents now separated by hundreds of miles of open water. They witnessed landscapes so radically different from our world that if you could travel back in time, you wouldn't recognize Earth itself. Imagine standing on the shore of what is now the middle of the North Sea, watching herds of woolly mammoths thunder across grasslands that stretch from Britain to the Netherlands. Or picture yourself crossing from Siberia to Alaska on foot, walking for weeks across a treeless plain that today lies beneath the Bering Strait. These aren't fantasies. They're historical realities that shape the very DNA flowing through your veins right now. How did our ancestors accomplish these incredible journeys across lands that have vanished beneath rising seas? What drove them to venture into unknown territories? What did these lost worlds look like, and why did they disappear? The story we're about to unfold spans over 100,000 years of human courage, adaptation, and survival. It's a tale written in stone tools dredged from ocean floors, in genetic codes that tell of ancient migrations, and in the bones of extinct giants that once shared these vanished lands with our forebears. This isn't just ancient history, it's the origin story of how humanity spread across the globe, conquering every continent except Antarctica. The bridges are gone, but their legacy lives in every human alive today. Chapter 1. The world beneath the waves. The ocean hides more than shipwrecks and coral reefs. Beneath the gentle roll of waves, beyond where sunlight penetrates the deep blue, lies an entire lost world. Not one world, actually, but many vast territories that were once dry land, complete with rivers, forests, and the footprints of our ancestors. To understand how early humans crossed these vanished lands, you first need to understand why these lands existed at all, and why they no longer do. The Earth you know today is a temporary snapshot in a constantly changing planetary story. For the past 2.5 million years, our planet has been cycling through what scientists call glacial and interglacial periods, ice ages, and warm periods. During the coldest phases of these ice ages, something extraordinary happened. Water that normally circulates between oceans, atmosphere, and land became locked up in massive ice sheets, some over 2 miles thick, that covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia. This wasn't a small amount of water. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, during what scientists call the last glacial maximum, so much water was trapped in ice that global sea levels dropped by approximately 120 meters, that's nearly 400 feet lower than today. To put that in perspective, imagine draining the ocean until the Statue of Liberty stands on dry ground with water barely reaching her waist. That's the scale we're talking about. This dramatic drop in sea level exposed vast areas of continental shelf, the relatively shallow underwater extensions of continents that slope gently away from coastlines. When these shelves emerged from beneath the waves, they created land bridges connecting regions that are now separated by water. These weren't narrow strips of land you could sprint across in an hour. Many were enormous territories, some as large as modern countries, with their own ecosystems, weather patterns, and geological features. The most famous of these vanished lands is Bering, the massive territory that once connected eastern Siberia with Alaska and western Canada. At its greatest extent, Bering was up to 1,000 kilometers wide, about 620 miles, and covered an area roughly the size of British Columbia and Alberta combined, totaling about 1.6 million square kilometers. Today, only small islands in the Bering Strait, the Diomede Islands, St. Lawrence Island, and a handful of others peak above the water as remnants of this once mighty land bridge. Across the globe, similar transformations were occurring. In Europe, a landmass called Doggerland stretched across what is now the North Sea, connecting Britain to the Netherlands, Denmark, and Germany. In Southeast Asia, the massive Sundaland shelf emerged, linking the modern islands of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and Bali to mainland Asia, creating a region scientists call Sundaland. To the south, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania joined together as the megacontinent Sahul. In the Middle East, sea levels dropped enough to expose easier crossing points across the Red Sea and create lush corridors through what is now desert. These exposed lands weren't barren moonscapes. They were living, breathing ecosystems with their own distinctive characteristics shaped by Ice Age climates. Many supported what scientists call mammoth steppe or steppe tundra, a unique type of grassland ecosystem that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. This environment supported an incredible diversity of large mammals: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, wild horses, giant deer, cave lions, and many others. The productivity of these grasslands was remarkable, sustaining animal populations that would astound us today. The disappearance of these lands began gradually around 18,000 years ago as global temperatures started to rise. The massive ice sheets began their long, slow melt, releasing countless cubic kilometers of water back into the oceans. Sea levels rose, not all at once, but in fits and starts over thousands of years. Sometimes the rise was relatively slow and steady. At other times, sudden collapses of ice sheets sent pulses of water surging into the oceans, raising sea levels more rapidly. The people living on these exposed lands watched their world shrink, generation by generation, as the sea crept higher. By about 8,000 years ago, most of these land bridges had vanished beneath the waves, though some lingered longer than others. The final flooding of Doggerland happened around this time, possibly accelerated by a massive tsunami triggered by a submarine landslide off the coast of Norway known as the Storegga Slide, the last land connection between Tasmania and mainland. Australia was severed sometime between 14,000 and 12,000 years ago. The Bering land bridge disappeared beneath the waves around 11,000 years ago, though some elevated areas may have remained as islands for longer. Today, these lands exist only in the memories encoded in our DNA, in artifacts occasionally dredged up by fishing nets, and in the seismic surveys and underwater archaeological investigations that are slowly revealing their secrets. They represent over 11% more land area than exists above water today. Entire countries, complete with mountains, rivers, valleys, and plains, now lie beneath the ocean surface. Understanding these lost worlds is crucial to understanding human history, because these were the highways, the bridges, and sometimes the homes of our ancestors as they spread across the planet. Chapter 2. The bridge between worlds. The wind howls across an endless plain, carrying snow that stings any exposed skin. You're standing on ground that will one day lie beneath 50 meters of seawater. But right now, 20,000 years ago, you're in the middle of the largest land bridge Earth has ever known. To your west lies Asia. To your east lies North America. But there are no borders here, no dividing lines. Just an immense stretch of treeless grassland called Beringia. Beringia wasn't just a bridge, it was a world unto itself. This massive landmass, stretching up to 1,000 kilometers at its widest point, formed whenever global ice ages locked enough water in glaciers to drop sea levels below the shallow Bering Strait. The land bridge first emerged millions of years ago and appeared and disappeared numerous times throughout the Pleistocene epoch. The most recent and best-studied emergence began around 70,000 years ago, existed in various forms, and finally vanished beneath the waves approximately 11,000 years ago. The landscape of Beringia was unlike anything you can see on Earth today. Despite being at such northern latitudes, much of this region remained ice-free during glacial periods. This seems counterintuitive. How could a land bridge in the Arctic remain unfrozen during an ice age? The answer lies in climate patterns. The same atmospheric conditions that piled ice thousands of meters thick over Canada and Scandinavia also created a cold desert in Beringia. The region received little precipitation, so despite frigid temperatures, massive glaciers couldn't form. Instead, a unique cold-adapted grassland ecosystem developed, supporting one of the richest assemblages of large mammals the world has ever known. Picture the wildlife that roam Beringia. Woolly mammoths with their distinctive curved tusks, some standing 4 meters tall at the shoulder. Steppe bison, larger than their modern descendants. Herds of wild horses, saiga antelope. Musk oxen, woolly rhinoceros. Cave lions, short-faced bears. And wolves. The productivity of this mammoth steppe was remarkable. Genetic studies of plant remains show that this ancient grassland supported a more diverse and nutritious mix of vegetation than the tundra that exists in these regions today. The grasses, sedges, and forbs growing in Beringia's cold but relatively dry climate created perfect fodder for grazing animals. For humans, Beringia represented both opportunity and challenge. The same harsh climate that supported abundant megafauna also tested human endurance and ingenuity. Archaeological evidence suggests that people lived in eastern Beringia at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier. These weren't travelers passing through. Genetic evidence indicates that populations may have spent thousands of years in Beringia, creating a distinct group scientists call ancient Beringians. DNA analysis of an infant buried at the Upward Sun River site in Alaska, dated to 11,500 years ago, revealed a unique genetic lineage that diverged from other Native American lineages approximately 20,000 years ago. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of Beringia. Rather than a simple highway that people crossed and forgot, Beringia was a refuge, a homeland where people lived for millennia. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets to the east and south made further progress into the Americas temporarily impossible, these Beringian populations waited. They adapted, survived, and eventually became the ancestors of many Native American populations when climate change finally opened corridors through the ice. The journey across Beringia wasn't a single migration, but rather a complex process involving multiple movements over thousands of years. Genetic evidence suggests waves of migration from East Asia into Beringia, mixing of different populations within Beringia itself, and then multiple dispersals from Beringia into the Americas. Some groups traveled south when the ice sheets retreated enough to open an ice-free corridor between the massive Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets that covered much of North America. Others may have traveled along the Pacific coast, using boats to navigate around glaciers. The how of crossing Beringia was straightforward. In one sense, people simply walked. But the reality was more complex. Crossing this vast expanse required intimate knowledge of the land, careful planning of routes between water sources, and the ability to hunt and gather enough food to sustain the journey. The crossing wasn't a deliberate expedition in the modern sense. Rather, it happened gradually as populations followed animal herds, as young people searched for new territories, or as communities slowly expanded their range generation by generation. Over hundreds or thousands of years, these incremental movements added up to a transcontinental migration. Beringia also facilitated traffic in both directions. DNA evidence shows that genetic exchange wasn't one-way. A 10,000-year-old genome from near Siberia's Kaloma River shows a DNA mix similar to Native American populations, suggesting that people migrated back from the Americas into Asia. The land bridge didn't close behind travelers like a door. It remained open for millennia, allowing movement, trade, and genetic exchange between populations on both sides. The end came gradually, then suddenly. Starting around 15,000 years ago, rising sea levels began to flood the lower areas of Beringia. The land bridge shrank from both east and west as water advanced. By 11,000 years ago, the Bering Strait had formed, separating the continents once more. The islands visible today, the Diomedes, St. Lawrence, St. Paul, and St. George, are the highest points of the former land bridge, the only parts that still rise above the waves. On these islands, archaeological sites have yielded stone tools, animal bones, and other traces of the people who once called Beringia home. Chapter 3. Europe's Atlantis. On a September day in 1931, a British trawler named Kalinda worked its nets through the murky waters of the North Sea, about 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk. As the crew hauled in their catch, they discovered something that shouldn't have been there, a large block of peat, and embedded within it, a beautifully crafted barbed point made from deer antler. The sailors had accidentally dredged up an artifact from a drowned world. They had found Doggerland. Doggerland is the name scientists now give to a vast expanse of land that once connected the British Isles to continental Europe. During the last ice age, when sea levels dropped by over 100 meters, the shallow floor of the North Sea became exposed land. This was in a narrow isthmus, but an enormous territory, at its greatest extent larger than many European countries, with its own rivers, lakes, hills, marshes, forests, and coastlines. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests that Doggerland was one of the richest, most productive landscapes in Mesolithic Europe, home to thriving communities of hunter-gatherers. The name Doggerland comes from the Dogger Bank, a large sandbar in the North Sea that represents one of the highest points of this vanished landscape. Dutch fishing boats called doggers frequently worked these shallow waters, giving the bank its name. In the 1990s, archaeologist Brian E. Coles coined the term Doggerland to describe the prehistoric landmass that once existed here. For over a century, scientists had suspected that such a landmass once existed, but Coles helped crystallize the concept and push for serious archaeological study of this submerged landscape. What did Doggerland look like? Thanks to remarkable collaboration between archaeologists and petroleum companies, we can now answer that question with surprising detail. Oil and gas companies routinely conduct seismic surveys of the North Sea floor, sending sound waves into the seabed to locate mineral deposits. These surveys create detailed three-dimensional maps of the layers beneath the ocean floor. When archaeologists like Vincent Gaffney from the University of Bradford gained access to this data, they saw something extraordinary: the ancient topography of Doggerland preserved in stunning detail. The seismic data reveals a complex, varied landscape. The southern and central parts of Doggerland featured gently rolling hills interspersed with river valleys and lakes. Major river systems drained the landscape, including what scientists have named the Schotten River, which flowed from the Dogger Bank Hills. To the north, the landscape became more dramatic, with steeper terrain and deeper valleys. The western edge of Doggerland, facing toward what is now the British coastline, featured extensive salt marshes, mudflats, lagoons, and beaches, prime territory for coastal resources. The climate of Doggerland changed dramatically over time. During the coldest phases of the Ice Age, when ice sheets covered northern Britain and Scandinavia, Doggerland would have been a cold, windswept landscape dominated by tundra and sparse vegetation. But as temperatures rose and ice sheets retreated around 15,000 to 11,000 years ago, Doggerland transformed into a rich mosaic of environments. Forests of birch, pine, and later oak spread across higher ground. Wetlands expanded in lower areas. The rivers teemed with fish. The land supported deer, wild boar, aurochs, wild cattle, and a variety of smaller game. For Mesolithic people, the hunter-gatherers who lived in Europe, between roughly 10,000 and 6,000 years ago, Doggerland was paradise. Archaeological evidence from artifacts recovered from the seafloor shows that people intensively exploited this rich environment. Fishermen have pulled up thousands of stone tools, bone and antler implements, and even human remains from these waters. The artifacts include finely crafted barbed points for fishing and hunting, stone axes, scrapers, and blades. Some tools show wear patterns indicating they were used for working plant materials, processing fish, and crafting wooden implements. One particularly evocative discovery consists of footprints. In some areas of the North Sea floor, perfect sets of human footprints have been preserved in ancient sediments, including sequences containing up to 39 consecutive prints. These footprints capture moments frozen in time, people walking along riverbanks or coastal zones 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, going about their daily activities, never imagining that their literal footsteps would be preserved for millennia. The people of Doggerland were skilled maritime specialists. They built boats, fished in rivers and along coasts, hunted seals and other marine mammals, and collected shellfish. Wooden paddles and fragments of dugout canoes dredged from the North Sea show their boat-building capabilities. Fish traps constructed from woven branches demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of fish behavior and tidal patterns. These weren't primitive people scraping by at the edge of survival. They were accomplished hunter-gatherers thriving in one of Europe's richest environments. The end of Doggerland came in stages. As global temperatures rose following the last glacial maximum, glaciers melted as sea levels began to rise. The lowest areas of Doggerland flooded first, creating lagoons, lakes, and eventually saltwater intrusions. By about 10,000 years ago, Doggerland had begun to fragment. What had been a continuous landmass broke into an archipelago of islands. The largest of these, which scientists call Dogger Island, may have covered an area roughly the size of Wales. Then, around 6150 BCE, catastrophe struck. Off the coast of Norway, an enormous submarine landslide occurred, known as the Storegga Slide. Approximately 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment collapsed down the continental slope, triggering a massive tsunami. The waves, estimated to be 25 meters high in some locations, swept across the North Sea. For the coastal communities of Doggerland, this would have been devastating. The tsunami likely killed thousands, destroyed settlements, and fundamentally altered the landscape. For a long time, scientists believed this tsunami was the final blow that separated Britain from Europe. However, recent research suggests the story is more complex. By the time of the Storegga tsunami, Doggerland had already been reduced to scattered islands by rising sea levels. The tsunami certainly would have devastated these islands, but complete submergence took several more centuries. By about 7,000 years ago, the last islands of Doggerland vanished beneath the waves. Britain had become an island, separated from the continent by the English Channel and the North Sea. Chapter 4. The Asian Eden. Close your eyes and imagine tropical Southeast Asia during the last ice age. Now erase the sea between the islands. Borneo, Java, Sumatra, Bali, these aren't islands anymore. They're highlands in a vast continent-sized landmass called Sundaland, connected to mainland Southeast Asia by gentle plains that today lie beneath the Java Sea and South China Sea. This is one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, both then and now, and it played a crucial role in human migration patterns. Sundaland represents one of the largest areas of exposed continental shelf during glacial periods. The Sunda Shelf covers approximately 1.85 million square kilometers, and during the last glacial maximum, nearly all of this was above water. This created an enormous extension of Southeast Asia with the Malay Peninsula, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and numerous smaller islands all connected as one landmass. To the east, deep water trenches always separated Sundaland from Wallacea, a zone of true oceanic islands, which in turn was separated from Sahul, the unified Australia-New Guinea continent. The distinction between Sundaland and regions to the east is so fundamental that it appears in the distribution of animals. British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace recognized this in the 19th century, identifying what became known as Wallace's Line, a boundary between the Asian and Australasian biological realms. Even when sea levels dropped, this deep water barrier remained. Asian mammals like tigers, elephants, and orangutans spread throughout Sundaland but never crossed to Wallacea. Similarly, Australian marsupials never made it west across the gap. This separation had existed for millions of years. The landscape of Sundaland during glacial periods was remarkably diverse. Unlike the cold steppes of Beringia, Sundaland remained tropical throughout the Ice Age. The region sits on the equator, ensuring consistent warmth year-round. However, the exposed shelf areas created new environments distinct from the interior of the existing islands. Massive river systems drained the landmass, flowing through what is now the Java Sea and South China Sea before emptying into the Pacific and Indian Oceans. These rivers created extensive floodplains and riparian forests that teemed with life. Paleoecological evidence suggests Sundaland supported a mix of evergreen tropical forests in wetter areas and more seasonal forests or grasslands in drier regions. The fauna was spectacular. Giant tigers, larger than any alive today, stalked through the forests. Several species of orangutans, today restricted to fragments of Borneo and Sumatra, ranged widely. Elephants, rhinoceros, wild cattle, and wild pigs flourished. The rivers hosted crocodiles, fish, and river dolphins. For hunter-gatherers, Sundaland offered year-round food resources, from tree fruits and nuts to game animals to aquatic foods. Humans had a long relationship with Sundaland. Our species, Homo sapiens, reached Southeast Asia at least 70,000 years ago and possibly earlier. But humans weren't alone in this region. Remarkably, other human species also lived in parts of Sundaland and adjacent Wallacea during the late Pleistocene. The island of Flores was home to the diminutive Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, which stood only about 1 meter tall. The Philippines hosted Homo luzonensis. These were distinct human species that had evolved in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. The interaction, if any, between Homo sapiens and these other human species remains mysterious. Did they encounter each other? Trade? Fight? Interbreed? Archaeological evidence is frustratingly sparse. What we do know is that Homo sapiens eventually spread throughout the region while the other human species went extinct. By 50,000 years ago, only Homo sapiens remained in Southeast Asia. For modern humans, Sundaland served as an important staging ground and refuge during their expansion from Africa across Asia. Genetic studies show that Southeast Asian populations harbor unique genetic lineages that diverge deep in time, suggesting long-term residence in the region. Some populations may have lived in Sundaland continuously for 50,000 years or more, adapting to local conditions and developing distinctive cultural practices. When sea levels began to rise at the end of the last ice age, the people of Sundaland faced a slow-motion disaster. Unlike the relatively rapid inundation of some land bridges, Sundaland's flooding occurred gradually over thousands of years. Starting around 18,000 years ago, the lowest areas began to flood. River valleys became estuaries. Coastal plains became tidal flats, then shallow seas. The process continued until about 5,000 years ago, by which time Sundaland had fragmented into the archipelago we know today. This gradual flooding had profound effects on human populations. As land area shrank, populations were forced to relocate, concentrate in remaining highland areas, or adapt to more maritime lifestyles. Some archaeologists suggest that the flooding of Sundaland may have triggered significant migrations throughout Southeast Asia and beyond, as displaced populations sought new territories. The development of sophisticated seafaring traditions in island Southeast Asia may partly be a response to the need to maintain connections between increasingly isolated communities on separating islands. The flooding of Sundaland also created one of the richest maritime environments on Earth. The shallow seas that formed over the Sunda shelf became incredibly productive fishing grounds. Coral reefs established themselves on the flooded landscape. The mix of freshwater runoff from the remaining islands and warm tropical seawater created nutrient-rich conditions that supported diverse marine life. Today, the Java Sea, South China Sea, and surrounding waters are among the world's most important fisheries, a legacy of the landscape that lies beneath. Chapter 5. The Great Southern Continent. 50,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, something unprecedented happened. Humans crossed from the edge of Southeast Asia into a completely new world. They became the first people to set foot on Sahul, the ancient continent that comprised modern Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea. This crossing required something no human had done before: deliberate ocean voyaging across open water to lands beyond the horizon. The story of how humans reached Sahul is a story of courage, ingenuity, and remarkable seafaring achievement. Sahul was a genuine megacontinent, roughly 10.6 million square kilometers at its maximum extent during periods of lowest sea level. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the United States. When ocean levels dropped by 120 meters during glacial maximums, the shallow seas between Australia, Tasmania, and New Guinea drained away, exposing a continuous landmass. The Torres Strait connecting Australia and New Guinea became a land bridge. The Bass Strait separating Tasmania from mainland Australia disappeared, replaced by a region called the Basin Plain. The landscape of Sahul was unlike anywhere else on Earth because of its unique evolutionary history. Australia had been separated from other continents for tens of millions of years, allowing its flora and fauna to evolve in complete isolation. The result was an ecosystem dominated by marsupials rather than placental mammals. When humans first arrived, they encountered an alien world populated by giant animals unlike anything in their ancestral homelands. Diprotodon, the largest marsupial ever known, stood as large as a hippopotamus. The marsupial lion Thylacoleo was an ambush predator with the strongest bite force relative to body size of any known mammal. Giant kangaroos standing over 2 meters tall hopped through the bush. Huge flightless birds, enormous lizards called megalania that reached up to 5 meters in length, and terrestrial crocodiles completed the menagerie. The challenge facing anyone wanting to reach Sahul was significant: water. Even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age, Sahul remained separated from Southeast Asia by deep ocean channels. The region between Sundaland and Sahul, called Wallacea after Alfred Russel Wallace, consists of thousands of islands scattered across deep seas. Even with lowered sea levels, crossing from Asia to Sahul required at least 8 to 10 separate water crossings, with some gaps of 60 to 100 kilometers across open ocean. These weren't calm rivers, but ocean passages with currents, waves, and no guarantee of land on the other side. This is where the story becomes truly remarkable. Archaeological evidence shows that humans reached Sahul by at least 50,000 years ago, and possibly as early as 65,000 years ago. Sites in northern Australia, including Majed B Rock Shelter and Arnhem Land, have yielded stone tools, ground ochre, and other artifacts reliably dated to around 65,000 years before present. This makes the journey to Sahul one of the earliest examples of deliberate ocean voyaging in human history. How did they do it? The honest answer is we don't know exactly, but recent modeling studies have shed light on the possibilities. Researchers have used computer simulations to model different crossing routes, taking into account Ice Age coastlines, ocean currents, and the capabilities of simple watercraft. The results are striking. The chance of accidentally drifting from Southeast Asia to Sahul, perhaps swept away during a storm or on a natural raft, is vanishingly small. The crossings were almost certainly intentional, planned, and repeated. Several potential routes existed. The southern route, crossing from Timor and Rhode Islands to what is now northwestern Australia, was likely the most commonly used. From high points on these islands, the mountains of Sahul would have been visible on clear days, providing a target to aim for. The northern route, from Sulawesi and adjacent islands toward New Guinea, offered more islands as stepping stones but required more water crossings. Genetic evidence suggests that people may have used both routes at different times. The watercraft used for these crossings didn't need to be sophisticated by modern standards, but they needed to be seaworthy. Simple rafts of bamboo lashed together would have worked for calm conditions and short crossings between visible islands. For longer crossings, dugout canoes or rafts with some means of propulsion and steering would have been necessary. The people making these journeys needed to be skilled seafarers, understanding currents, weather patterns, and how to navigate by the sun and stars. Critically, establishing a viable population on Sahul required more than a single lucky crossing. Genetic modeling suggests that hundreds of people would have needed to make the journey over a relatively short period, perhaps just a few centuries, to create a sustainable breeding population. This implies organized, repeated voyaging involving entire family groups. These weren't solo adventurers or small bands of explorers, but coordinated migration efforts. Once on Sahul, humans spread with remarkable speed. Within a few thousand years, people had reached every corner of the continent, from the tropical north to the temperate south, from coastal areas to the arid interior. Sites dated to around 40,000 years ago appear in southern Australia and Tasmania, showing that the entire continent was colonized within perhaps 10,000 years of the initial arrival. This rapid expansion suggests that the early Sundalanders were highly mobile, adaptable, and skilled at exploiting new environments. The arrival of humans in Sahul had profound effects on the continent's ecosystems. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most of the megafauna went extinct. The causes remain debated: climate change, human hunting, or a combination. But the timing is striking. By about 42,000 years ago, all animals weighing more than 40 to 44 kilograms had disappeared, along with many smaller species. The landscape itself changed as humans used fire to manage vegetation, creating more open forests and grasslands that suited their hunting and gathering practices. The flooding of Sahul began around 18,000 years ago as the last ice age ended. Rising seas gradually separated Tasmania from the mainland, creating the Bering Strait. This process may have happened quite rapidly in its final stages. Some estimates suggest the strait could have flooded at rates of over 20 meters of sea level rise per year in some locations. People who had crossed the land bridge on journeys taking years could have found themselves cut off permanently when they tried to return. The separation of Tasmania isolated Aboriginal Tasmanian populations for the next 12,000 years until European contact. The Torres Strait separating Australia from New Guinea also flooded, creating a complex maze of islands and shallow seas. This didn't completely isolate the two regions. People continued to travel back and forth, but it did make the connection much more difficult. Finally, by about 8,000 years ago, the flooding was complete. Australia had taken on its modern form, isolated from the rest of the world by ocean barriers. Chapter 6: The Kelp Highway and Coastal Migrations. For decades, the story of how humans reached the Americas focused on one route, across Beringia and down through an ice-free corridor between massive glaciers covering North America. But mounting evidence suggests this may not be the whole story or even the main story. An alternative theory has gained significant support: the Kelp Highway hypothesis, which proposes that people traveled not through the interior, but along the Pacific coast, possibly in boats, taking advantage of rich maritime resources. The Kelp Highway gets its name from giant kelp forests that grow along temperate coastlines. These underwater forests, particularly species like bull kelp, create incredibly productive ecosystems that support abundant fish, shellfish, sea odd, sea otters, and seabirds. For maritime adapted people, kelp forests represent a food bonanza. The hypothesis suggests that people adapted to coastal living in Northeast Asia followed these kelp forests all the way from Bering down the Pacific coast to settle the Americas. The beauty of the coastal route is that it bypasses the problems associated with the interior ice-free corridor. For much of the late Ice Age, massive ice sheets, the Cordilleran in the west and the Laurentide in the east, covered most of Canada and parts of the northern United States. These ice sheets were kilometers thick in places and created a formidable barrier to human movement. Even when a corridor opened between them, it was often a harsh, barren landscape with limited resources. Archaeological evidence suggests this corridor didn't become truly viable until about 12,500 years ago. In contrast, the Pacific coastline became ice-free thousands of years earlier. By 16,000 years ago, the western coast of North America was largely accessible, with glaciers having retreated enough to expose coastlines and allow travel. If people were traveling by boat, they could simply skirt around any remaining glacial ice extending to the sea. This timing matches better with archaeological evidence of human presence in the Americas. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile have been reliably dated to 14,500 years ago, and the Paisley Caves in Oregon show human occupation at 14,300 years ago. These dates suggest people were in the Americas before the interior corridor was fully open. Genetic evidence strongly supports the coastal migration hypothesis. When geneticists analyze Native American DNA, they see signs of rapid population expansion and rapid divergence of different lineages across both North and South America. This pattern, people spreading quickly and populations splitting rapidly, is easier to explain if people were traveling by boat along coastlines rather than walking through the interior. Boats allow faster movement and can carry more supplies and people, enabling more rapid colonization. The challenge in proving the coastal migration hypothesis is that direct evidence is scarce. The same rising sea levels that flooded Bering also drowned the ancient Pacific coastlines. Any campsites, tools, or other remains left by coastal people 15,000 years ago now lie beneath 100 meters of water, often several kilometers offshore from current coastlines. Underwater archaeology in these regions is challenging, expensive, and has barely begun. We read essentially looking for needles in a haystack small archaeological sites scattered across thousands of kilometers of now submerged coastline, buried under marine sediments. Despite these challenges, tantalizing clues have emerged. On Haida Gwaii, an island chain off the coast of British Columbia, archaeologists have found stone tools and other artifacts at sites that date back 14,000 years or more. These were people living on what was then the outer coast, demonstrating maritime adaptation and coastal living. Channel Islands off California show human occupation dating back at least 13,000 years, again indicating coastal populations. These islands were never connected to the mainland, even at lowest sea levels, proving these ancient people had boats capable of making open water crossings. The kelp forests themselves provide ecological continuity along this route. From Japan through the Aleutian Islands, down the Pacific coast of North America, and all the way to southern Chile, kelp forests create similar environments with similar resources. A population adapted to kelp forest living in Northeast Asia would find familiar resources all along this route. Fish, shellfish, sea mammals, seabirds, and marine plants would have been available continuously. This ecological highway required different skills than interior hunting, but offered reliable year-round food sources. The coastal migration model doesn't necessarily contradict the Bering land bridge theory. People still cross Bering. We have genetic and archaeological evidence for that. But instead of immediately heading inland, coastal migrants may have followed the shorelines, using boats to navigate around obstacles. Some populations may have lived along Beringian coasts, becoming maritime specialists before ever setting foot in the Americas proper. When ice sheets blocked land routes, the ocean remained open. Evidence suggests that people had the technological capabilities for such journeys. By 40,000 years ago, humans had crossed open water to reach Sahul, demonstrating sophisticated seafaring abilities. By 30,000 years ago, people had reached islands in the western Pacific that required deliberate ocean voyaging. Stone tools from coastal sites in Asia and Beringia show technology suitable for maritime adaptations, specialized tools for processing fish, working wood for boats, and making fishing gear. The Kelp highway hypothesis also helps explain puzzling genetic patterns in Native American populations. Rather than a single wave of migration, the genetic data suggests multiple pulses of people entering the Americas at different times. A coastal route makes this easier to understand. Boats can make multiple trips. Populations can spread along coasts, then later groups can follow the same routes. The ocean connects rather than divides, allowing continued contact and exchange between populations in Beringia and those further south. Recent archaeological work continues to refine our understanding. Caves along the Pacific coast that remained ice-free during the last glacial maximum are being systematically investigated. Marine sediment cores from the continental shelf are being analyzed for traces of ancient human activity. Underwater remote sensing technology is advancing, allowing archaeologists to map submerged landscapes and identify promising sites for excavation. Each new discovery adds pieces to the puzzle. The story emerging is one of versatility and adaptation. Our ancestors weren't committed exclusively to one lifestyle or one route. They were generalists who could exploit both terrestrial and maritime resources. Some populations specialized in interior hunting, following megafauna across the plains. Others became coastal specialists, masters of the sea. Most probably moved between these lifestyles as circumstances demanded. The peopling of the Americas wasn't a simple march from point A to point B, but a complex, multi-generational process involving multiple routes, multiple migrations, and diverse adaptive strategies. Chapter 7. The Red Sea Crossings. The story of human migration doesn't begin with land bridges connecting continents. It begins in Africa, where our species evolved, and with the question that has fascinated researchers for decades. How and when did humans first leave Africa to colonize the rest of the world? The answer involves several potential routes, but none has generated more debate than the southern route across the Red Sea, crossing that may have used land bridges, coastal routes, or even early seafaring. About 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa. For hundreds of thousands of years, our species remained primarily in Africa, evolving, developing complex behaviors, creating sophisticated tools, and building the cognitive capabilities that would eventually enable us to colonize the entire planet. Then, sometime between 80,000 and 120,000 years ago, small groups began to venture beyond Africa's borders. The routes they took would shape all subsequent human history. The most debated southern route crosses the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow passage between the Horn of Africa, modern Djibouti and Eritrea, and the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen. Today, this strait is about 30 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, but during glacial periods when sea levels dropped, it would have been even narrower, perhaps as little as 4 to 8 kilometers in some places. However, even at the lowest sea levels, the strait never completely closed to form a continuous land bridge. Deep trenches in the seabed, carved by tectonic activity as the Red Sea Rift opened, ensured that water always separated Africa from Arabia. This geological reality has important implications. If humans crossed the Bab el-Mandeb during the Ice Age, they must have used boats or rafts, even if the crossing was much shorter than today. This makes the southern route potentially the earliest evidence of deliberate seafaring in human history. Some researchers argue this is implausible. Surely simple boats capable of such crossings came later. Others point out that humans had already demonstrated sophisticated cognitive abilities by this time, and that building simple rafts is well within the capabilities of any human group living near water. Archaeological evidence from the Arabian Peninsula suggests humans were indeed there much earlier than once thought. At Jebel Faya in what is now the United Arab Emirates, stone tools have been dated to approximately 125,000 years ago. In Oman, tools dated to about 106,000 years ago show striking similarities to Nubian-style tools from Northeast Africa. These artifacts aren't just similar, they're remarkably close in their manufacturing technique, suggesting direct cultural connection between African and Arabian populations. The implications are profound. If humans reached Arabia 106,000 or 125,000 years ago, they left Africa during the last interglacial period before the most recent Ice Age, a time when the Red Sea was actually at higher levels than today, making crossings more difficult, not easier. This suggests either that these early migrants had sophisticated boats, or that they used alternative routes. One possibility is the northern route through the Sinai Peninsula, which provides a land connection between Africa and Asia. Another is that they traveled along the Arabian coastline, moving north along the Red Sea shore to where the strait is narrowest. However, the story of these early Arabian inhabitants remains frustratingly incomplete. Did they die out, representing a failed expansion that left no descendants? Or did they survive, adapt, and contribute to later populations? Genetic evidence provides some clues but no definitive answers. The primary, out-of-Africa expansion that led to all modern non-African populations appears to have occurred around 70,000 to 80,000 years ago, involving a relatively small group, perhaps fewer than 1,000 individuals who carried distinctive mitochondrial DNA, lineages designated as haplogroups M and N. Recent research using advanced sea-level reconstruction models has revealed several potential migration corridors in the Red Sea region that existed at different times. One involves a route from Foul Bay on the Egyptian coast of the Red Sea through now submerged lands, connecting to the Nile River Valley. This would have provided an alternative to the long overland journey through the Sinai. The Gulf of Aqaba at the northern end of the Red Sea also narrowed during glacial periods, potentially offering another crossing point toward the Levant. The complexity increases when we consider that migrations weren't one-directional. Genetic evidence shows that after the initial out-of-Africa dispersal, there were later back migrations into Africa. Eurasian genetic markers appear in some African populations, particularly in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region, suggesting that people who had left Africa or their descendants later returned. The Red Sea crossings, whether by boat or along coastal routes, facilitated movement in both directions. The environment of Arabia during wet periods would have been dramatically different from the desert we see today. During interglacial periods, when monsoons were stronger, the Arabian Peninsula received significantly more rainfall. Lakes formed in areas that are now dry basins. Rivers flowed where today there is only sand. Grasslands and woodlands covered much of the interior. For human populations, a green Arabia would have been an attractive destination, offering resources similar to African savannas. Climate fluctuations drove much of this early migration. When North Africa and Arabia were wet and productive, populations could expand out of Africa and thrive. During dry periods, deserts form barriers, isolating populations and potentially driving extinctions. The story of early human migrations is intimately tied to these climate oscillations. The land bridges and coastal routes that facilitated movement appeared and disappeared in sync with ice ages and interglacials, opening and closing doors to human dispersal. Recent discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. In 2023, researchers announced evidence of a well-watered corridor through the Jordan Rift Valley that humans used approximately 84,000 years ago. Small wetlands served as staging posts as people moved north from Africa through the Levant. Rather than large lakes, which previous studies had focused on, these small but reliable water sources provided crucial resources for traveling groups. This northern route through the Sinai and Levant may have been more important than previously recognized. The debate continues about whether the southern Red Sea route or the northern Levantine route was primary in human dispersal from Africa. Genetic data can be interpreted to support either scenario. Archaeological evidence is incomplete for both routes. The truth may be that both routes were used at different times by different populations. Humans are opportunistic and adaptable. When one route was blocked by climate or sea level, another might open. The story of human migration isn't a single highway, but a network of paths. Some taken once, others used repeatedly over tens of thousands of years. Chapter 8. The island Bamzi, between the vast continental shelves of Sundaland and Sahul, lies a region unlike any other on Earth, Wallacea. Named after Alfred Russel Wallace, the naturalist who first recognized its unique character. This is a realm of true oceanic islands, separated by deep water trenches that never closed even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. For early humans, spreading from Asia toward Australia, Wallacea represented both a formidable barrier and the only route forward. Crossing it required capabilities that most scholars once believed came much later in human history. Sophisticated seafaring and navigation across open ocean. Wallacea encompasses thousands of islands scattered across millions of square kilometers of ocean, including Sulawesi, the Maluku Islands, Nusa Tenggara, and many smaller archipelagos. The region is geologically complex, sitting at the collision zone between continental plates, where volcanic activity and earthquakes are common. The underwater topography is dramatic. Some of the deepest ocean trenches on Earth separate these islands from adjacent continental shelves. The Makassar Strait between Borneo and Sulawesi reaches depths of over 2,000 meters. The seas between Timor and Australia plunge to 3,000 meters or more. This deep water has profound implications. Even when sea levels dropped 120 meters during glacial maximums, these trenches remained. You couldn't walk from Sundaland to Sahul. At minimum, reaching Australia from Southeast Asia required at least 8 to 10 separate water crossings, some spanning 60 to 100 kilometers of open ocean. These weren't calm rivers or narrow straits where you could see both shores. These were serious ocean passages with currents, swells, and very real dangers. Yet humans made these crossings at least 50,000 years ago and possibly much earlier. How? Why? And what does this tell us about human cognitive and technological capabilities in the deep past? These questions have driven decades of research and sparked fascinating debates about the nature of early human maritime adaptation. The islands of Wallacea themselves harbor clues to an even older human presence. On Flores, one of the lesser Sunda Islands, archaeologists discovered remains of Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit, a diminutive human species that stood only about 1 meter tall. The fossils date from approximately 100,000 to 60,000 years ago, but tools on Flores suggest human relatives lived there as early as 1 million years ago. Some ancient human species, made water crossings to Flores hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens arrived. Similarly, on Luzon in the Philippines, remains of Homo luzonensis dated to at least 67,000 years ago indicate another ancient human population on an oceanic island. On Sulawesi, stone tools dated to about 200,000 years ago suggest pre-modern human presence. These discoveries shatter old assumptions about human maritime capabilities. If archaic humans with presumably simpler technology could reach oceanic islands, then Homo sapiens with our advanced cognitive abilities certainly could. For modern humans crossing Wallacea en route to Sahul, several possible routes existed. The southern route, crossing from Bali through the lesser Sunda Islands Lombok, Sumbawa, Flores, Timor offered relatively short crossings between visible islands. From the eastern islands, particularly Timor and Roti, the mountains of Australia would have been visible on clear days from high elevations, providing a navigation target. The northern route, from Sulawesi toward New Guinea and its offshore islands, involved more crossings, but through a region rich in marine resources. Computer simulations modeling these crossings have produced striking results. When researchers input realistic parameters, simple rafts or dugout canoes, human paddling capabilities, ocean currents, and weather patterns, and run thousands of simulated crossings, the models show that accidental drift from one island to another is extremely unlikely. The currents in Wallacea don't conveniently sweep rafts from island to island. In fact, currents often push in unhelpful directions. For crossings to succeed, people needed to deliberately set course, maintain that course against currents and winds, and paddle or sail with purpose. This strongly suggests intentional voyaging. But how did they know where to go? The ability to see distant land from high points on islands would have helped. On clear days, mountains on islands 60 or 80 kilometers away can be visible from elevation. Smoke from natural fires might provide distant markers. Clouds that form over islands in tropical regions create visual cues to land beyond the horizon. Seabirds flying in particular directions at dawn and dusk indicate land. Traditional Polynesian navigators, who later mastered the Pacific, used all these clues and more. The watercraft required for these crossings didn't need to be sophisticated by Polynesian standards, which involved large ocean-going outrigger canoes and sophisticated navigation techniques. Simple rafts of bamboo lashed together would work for short crossings in calm conditions. Dugout canoes carved from large trees would provide better seaworthiness and maneuverability. The key requirement was simply being watertight enough to keep people and essential supplies dry during crossings that might take a full day or longer. Establishing viable populations on islands required more than a single successful crossing. Genetic studies indicate that founding populations needed to be large enough, at least several dozen individuals, and probably hundreds to avoid inbreeding and maintain genetic diversity. This implies repeated voyaging or large groups making crossings together. It also suggests a level of social organization and planning. You don't accidentally gather hundreds of people and all end up on the same distant island. These were coordinated efforts. The people making these crossings were already maritime adapted. Archaeological sites from coastal Southeast Asia show sophisticated use of marine resources by at least 40,000 years ago and probably much earlier. Shell middens, ancient garbage dumps full of discarded shells, reveal intensive collection of shellfish. Fish remains show fishing technology. The presence of deep-sea fish species in some assemblages indicates offshore fishing, probably from boats. These were skilled coastal peoples for whom the ocean was opportunity, not barrier. Wallacea today is recognized as one of Earth's biodiversity hotspots, with unique species found nowhere else. The Wallace Line represents a fundamental biogeographic boundary, with Asian fauna to the west and Australasian fauna to the east. Few terrestrial animals crossed this barrier. Naturally, those that did arrive by rare long-distance dispersal events, or in some cases, were brought by humans. But for humans, Wallacea became a corridor, albeit a challenging one. The island-hopping route through Wallacea connected two continental realms and enabled one of humanity's greatest achievements, reaching and settling the previously empty continent of Sahul. Chapter 9. The technology of SURVIVO crossing. Vanished land bridges wasn't simply a matter of walking from point A to point B. It required an array of technologies, skills, and knowledge that allowed early humans to survive and thrive in unfamiliar environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical coastlines. The tools and techniques that enabled these migrations represent some of humanity's greatest innovations. Developed over thousands of years and passed down through generations. Stone tool technology formed the foundation of survival. The ability to craft sharp edges from stone gave humans multi-purpose tools for cutting, scraping, piercing, and chopping. By the time humans were making major migrations across land bridges, between 100,000 and 10,000 years, logo stone tool traditions had become highly sophisticated. Different regions developed distinctive styles that archaeologists can identify and trace, allowing them to track migration routes. The Nubian tool tradition found in northeastern Africa, for example, appears in archaeological sites in Arabia, suggesting direct cultural connections between African and Arabian populations who crossed the Red Sea region. In Beringia, tools show influences from both Northeast Asian and North American traditions, reflecting the region's role as a crossroads. The similarity of tool styles across Doggerland and adjacent parts of Britain and continental Europe demonstrates cultural continuity across this landscape before it flooded. But stone tools were just the beginning. Weapons for hunting represented crucial technology. By 40,000 years ago, humans had developed throwing spears, not just thrusting spears used at close range, but projectiles that could be thrown from a distance, giving hunters a significant advantage over dangerous prey. Spear throwers, called Atlatls, appeared by at least 30,000 years ago in some regions, using leverage to increase throwing velocity and distance. Bows and arrows appeared later, probably around 20,000 years ago, though the evidence is debated. For people crossing Beringia and other cold environments, clothing technology was literally a matter of life and death. In temperatures that regularly dropped far below freezing, exposed skin would suffer frostbite within minutes. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated tailored clothing by at least 40,000 years ago. Hide needles made from bone allow sewing of fitted garments. Animal hides, carefully prepared through scraping, soaking, and treating, provided insulation. Furs from animals like Arctic foxes, wolves, and caribou offered maximum warmth. Multiple layers, inner layer with fur against skin, outer layer with fur outward, created effective insulation systems. Footwear was equally crucial. Walking long distances across frozen ground without proper foot protection would cause severe injury. Moccasin-style shoes, boots stuffed with insulating grasses, and other foot coverings developed in northern regions. The fact that humans successfully colonized even the harshest Arctic regions demonstrates remarkably effective cold weather technology. Fire technology enabled survival almost everywhere. The ability to create fire on demand, to maintain fires during travel, and to use fire for cooking. Warmth, light, and protection from predators gave humans unparalleled flexibility. Evidence shows humans controlled fire by at least 400,000 years ago, and probably much earlier. By the time of the major land bridge crossings, fire making was routine. Various techniques existed: striking pyrite against flint to create sparks, using friction from rapidly rotating wooden spindles, or preserving embers in slow-burning materials, like dried fungus carried in special containers. For coastal and riverine migrations, watercraft technology was transformative. The earliest boats were probably simple raft logs or bundles of reeds lashed together, providing buoyancy. Dugout canoes, carved from large tree trunks, appeared very early. A 10,000-year-old dugout found in the Netherlands shows sophisticated boat building, but the technology is certainly much older. Paddles allow propulsion and steering. Simple sails, using animal hides or woven materials, could harness wind power. The boats didn't need to be large or fancy. They just needed to float, carry people and essential supplies, and be controllable enough to reach intended destinations. Fishing technology also evolved. Bone and antler hooks allowed line fishing. Spears, often with detachable points connected by cordage, enabled spearing of fish in shallow water. Nets woven from plant fibers or sinew allowed catching multiple fish efficiently. Fish traps, clever structures of woven branches or stones arranged to guide fish into enclosures, required no active attention once set. Many of these technologies are documented from sites dating to 20,000 years ago or earlier. Perhaps most important was knowledge, the accumulated wisdom passed down through generations. Where to find water in seemingly barren landscapes. Which plants are edible and which are poisonous. How to read weather signs. Where game animals congregate at different seasons. How to navigate using sun, stars, landmarks, and subtle environmental cues. This knowledge couldn't be written down. Written language was still thousands of years in the future, but was carefully preserved through oral traditions. Stories, songs, and direct teaching. Social organization and cooperation were technologies in their own right. Successfully crossing land bridges and colonizing new territories required groups working together. Sharing resources, dividing labor, caring for sick and injured members, and making group decisions about when and where to travel all depended on social structures that facilitated cooperation. The fact that humans succeeded in reaching and colonizing every habitable continent speaks to remarkably effective social systems. Language itself was perhaps the ultimate technology enabling these migrations. The ability to share complex information, make plans, tell stories of past travels, warn of dangers, and teach skills to the next generation all depended on sophisticated linguistic communication. When humans crossed land bridges, they carried their languages with them, and linguistic evidence today still bears traces of these ancient movements in the relationships between language families. Chapter 10. When the waters ROS. Imagine being among the last generation to walk across what would soon be ocean floor. Perhaps you're a young adult in a Doggerland community 8,200 years ago. Your grandparents tell stories of when the land stretched far to the horizon, when you could walk for days in any direction without seeing the sea. But in your lifetime, things have changed. Each year, the spring floods seem a little higher. The old camping sites your family used near the river mouth are now permanently underwater. Islands that were once hills in the interior are becoming isolated by channels. The world is shrinking, and no one knows how to stop it. This was reality for countless people living on land bridges at the end of the last ice age, starting around 18,000 years ago. Global temperatures began rising as Earth transitioned out of the glacial maximum. The massive ice sheets that had imprisoned so much of Earth's water began to melt. Initially, the process was slow, a meter or two of sea level rise per century, barely noticeable in a human lifetime. But the trend was inexorable, and it accelerated. The melting wasn't uniform or steady. Ice sheets don't melt like ice cubes in warm water. They exhibit complex behaviors, with periods of relative stability punctuated by rapid collapses. When portions of ice sheets became unstable, perhaps undermined by warming oceans at their bases, or surging forward under their own weight, they could release enormous volumes of water quickly. These meltwater pulses cause rapid sea level rise, sometimes a meter or more per century, occasionally even faster. One such pulse, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. In just a few centuries, sea levels rose by approximately 14 to 18 meters, roughly 45 to 60 feet. For people living in low-lying coastal areas or on land bridges with gentle topography, This would have been catastrophic. Lands that had been inhabited for generations simply vanished beneath the waves. Another major pulse, Meltwater Pulse 1b, hit around 11,300 years ago, raising sea levels another 10 to 15 meters in a few centuries. The human experience of these changes varied by location. In places like the Bashan Plain connecting Tasmania to mainland Australia, where the seafloor is relatively flat, the flooding may have been rapid in its final stages. Scientists estimate that in some locations, sea level could have risen 20 meters or more per year, meaning the sea advanced hundreds of meters inland annually. A person who walked across the land bridge on a multi-year journey might have found the return route permanently cut off by the time they tried to return. In other locations, like Bering, the process was more gradual but equally relentless. The land bridge began shrinking from both ends as water rose. The lowest areas flooded first, creating lagoons and eventually narrow straits. Higher ground persisted longer, eventually becoming islands like the Diomedes that exist today. By 11,000 years ago, the Bering Strait had formed, permanently separating Alaska from Siberia. Populations who had regularly moved between Asia and North America found themselves suddenly divided by an ocean. Doggerland's end was particularly dramatic. By 8,500 years ago, Doggerland had already been reduced to scattered islands by rising seas. Then, around 6150 BCE, catastrophe struck from an unexpected direction. Off the coast of Norway, a massive submarine landslide known as the Storegga Slide occurred. Approximately 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment and area, the size of Iceland, suddenly slid down the continental slope into the deep ocean. The displacement generated a tsunami that radiated across the North Sea. Geological evidence shows that waves up to 25 meters high struck the coastlines of what is now Scotland and northeastern England. For the low-lying islands that remained of Doggerland, this would have been devastating. Settlements, people, animals, everything in the path of these waves would have been swept away. While the Storegga tsunami didn't sink Doggerland, entirely rising seas had already done most of that work. It likely administered the final blow to remaining communities. Within a few centuries, the last islands vanished, and Britain became permanently separated from the continent. The human toll of these floodings is difficult to calculate, but must have been immense. Thousands of square kilometers of inhabited land disappeared. Archaeological evidence shows that many of the most productive hunting, fishing, and gathering sites were located exactly in the areas that flooded coastal zones, river valleys, lake shores. These were prime real estate for hunter-gatherers, and they were the first places to go underwater. Populations had to relocate, often to less productive areas. Island regions that remained above rising seas often had poorer soils, fewer resources, and harsher climates than the lost lowlands. Competition for remaining good territories likely intensified, potentially causing conflicts. Some populations may have been completely wiped out when particularly rapid flooding events overwhelmed their ability to relocate. Yet, humans also adapted with remarkable resilience. As lands flooded, people became more maritime-oriented. Communities that had been primarily terrestrial hunter-gatherers shifted to greater reliance on fishing, shellfish collection, and seal hunting. Boat technology improved out of necessity. The scattered islands that remained of places like Doggerland required boats to maintain connections, driving innovation in watercraft design. Trade networks adapted to the new geography. Materials and goods that once moved overland now traveled by sea. This may have increased the range of exchange networks in some ways, as boats could carry heavier loads than human porters. Maritime cultures developed sophisticated knowledge of currents, tides, winds, and navigation skills that would eventually enable humans to colonize even the most remote Pacific islands. The flooding also preserved an invaluable archaeological record. Sites that would have been disturbed or destroyed by later activity on land were instead gently buried under marine sediments. Today, the seafloor around former land bridges contains thousands of archaeological sites in remarkable states of preservation. Organic materials like wood, bone, and plant remains that typically decay rapidly on land can be preserved in oxygen-poor marine sediments. Even footprints pressed into ancient mud have survived. Modern archaeological techniques are finally allowing us to explore these submerged landscapes systematically. Seismic surveys, originally developed for petroleum exploration, reveal ancient topography beneath the seafloor. Side-scan sonar maps the surface. Remotely operated vehicles equipped with cameras investigate specific sites. Sediment cores bring up samples for analysis. And in some areas, divers can physically excavate underwater sites, just as archaeologists excavate on land. These investigations are revealing details about the end of the land bridge era. We can identify specific abandoned campsites, drowned forests, submerged river channels, and even ancient coastlines. We can sometimes reconstruct the sequence of flooding, determining which areas went under first and how quickly the process occurred. This work is transforming our understanding of a crucial period in human history, the transition from the Ice Age world of exposed land bridges to the modern configuration of continents separated by oceans. Chapter 11. Legacy of the Lost Aliens. The land bridges are gone, claimed by rising seas 8,000 years ago. The people who walked across them are dust, their immediate descendants long dead. Yet the influence of these vanished lands echoes through time, shaping the modern world in profound ways. The bridges may be lost, but their legacy lives on in our genes, our cultures, our languages, and even in the environmental challenges we face today. Consider the genetic legacy first. Every person whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carries DNA that traveled across at least one land bridge. The particular genetic markers you possess. The mitochondrial DNA passed down through your mother's line. The Y chromosome DNA passed through your father's line. These molecular signatures preserve evidence of ancient migrations. Geneticists can trace these markers backward, reconstructing the routes your ancestors took as they dispersed from Africa across Asia into Europe over Bering, and eventually to every corner of the globe. The timing encoded in genetic mutations tells us when different populations split from each other, often corresponding precisely to when land bridges existed or vanished. The ancient Beringen lineage that diverged about 20,000 years ago in Beringia. The rapid divergence of Native American lineages as people spread through the Americas. The separation of Aboriginal Tasmanian populations when the Bering Strait flooded. All these events are recorded in DNA like tree rings, recording years of growth. Genetic research has revealed unexpected connections. The Denisovans, an extinct human lineage known primarily from a few fragments of bone found in a Siberian cave, left genetic traces in modern populations. Denisovan DNA makes up several percent of the genome in some indigenous Australian and Papuan populations, meaning these ancient humans must have been in Southeast Asia or Wallacea, where interbreeding could occur. Without the exposed land of Sundaland and Sahul, this genetic exchange would never have happened. Language provides another window into land bridge history. Linguists have long noted intriguing connections between language families on opposite sides of vanished land bridges. While the deep history of language relationships remains controversial, some patterns are clear. The Na-Dene languages of North America and Yenisei languages of Siberia show possible relationships, potentially reflecting connections maintained when Beringia existed. The Austronesian language family, though spread by later seafaring peoples, may have roots in populations that once inhabited expanded landmasses of Southeast Asia. Cultural practices and traditions sometimes preserve memories of land bridges. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions, carefully maintained for tens of thousands of years, include stories of land that was flooded by rising seas. Some traditions speak of ancestors walking to what are now islands. Archaeological investigation of sites mentioned in these traditions has sometimes confirmed details, demonstrating the extraordinary time depth of oral histories. Native American traditions similarly include flood stories and accounts of migrations that correspond to known climate and sea level changes. The extinction of megafauna represents another complicated legacy. When humans crossed land bridges into new territories, they encountered animals that had evolved without human predation. Giant marsupials in Australia, mammoth and mastodon in the Americas, massive flightless birds in various locations. These animals had no learned fear of human hunters. Within relatively short time periods after human arrival, most of these large animals went extinct. Climate change certainly played a role, but human hunting pressure likely tipped many species over the edge. The ecology of entire continents was transformed, with cascading effects that persist today. The flooding of land bridges may have driven some of humanity's most important innovations. The development of agriculture, for instance, occurred during and after the period when sea levels were rising most rapidly. Some researchers have suggested that the loss of productive coastal plains where hunter-gatherers had thrived forced surviving populations to find new subsistence strategies. With the best gathering grounds underwater and populations concentrated in remaining areas, the pressure to intensify food production may have contributed to the agricultural revolution. Maritime technology certainly advanced as flooding separated populations. The sophisticated seafaring of Polynesian peoples, who colonized the remote Pacific islands using advanced navigation techniques and ocean-going canoes, built on earlier maritime traditions developed by coastal peoples. The Austronesian expansion, which spread people from Taiwan throughout Southeast Asia and eventually to Madagascar and Easter Island, occurred after sea levels had risen and was enabled by advanced boat technology developed through thousands of years of coastal living. Today, the drowned land bridges are becoming relevant again in an unexpected way, as cautionary tales about sea level rise. The same processes that flooded Beringia, Doggerland, and Sundaland melting ice sheets. Warming temperatures, rising seas are occurring again, this time driven by human-caused climate change rather than natural cycles. Understanding how quickly seas can rise, how land bridges disappear, and how human populations must adapt to shrinking territory has gone from archaeological curiosity to urgent, contemporary relevance. The archaeological sites buried on former land bridges contain irreplaceable information about human history. These underwater sites are now threatened by modern activities. Bottom trawling by fishing vessels drags heavy gear across the seafloor, destroying archaeological sites. Offshore wind farm construction, while important for renewable energy, requires extensive seafloor disturbance. Sand mining for beach nourishment and construction excavates seabed sediments. Each of these activities destroys pieces of our heritage. Fortunately, awareness of submerged archaeological landscapes is growing. Laws in some countries now protect underwater heritage sites. Archaeological assessments are sometimes required before major seabed construction. Researchers are racing to document and understand these sites before they're lost. Advanced technologies make this increasingly possible. Autonomous underwater vehicles can survey vast areas. DNA techniques can extract genetic information from sediments without excavating remains. Virtual reality can recreate submerged landscapes, allowing people to walk across Doggerland or Beringia as they existed thousands of years. The scientific study of land bridges has transformed from a marginal specialty to a central component of human origins research. Every year brings new discoveries, new sites, new techniques, new insights. We now know that human history is more complex, more interesting, and more interconnected than anyone imagined a few decades ago. The simplistic narratives of the past single migration routes, uniform cultures, straightforward progressions have given way to rich, nuanced understandings of diverse peoples adapting to changing environments in myriad ways. The greatest legacy of the land. Bridges may be what they reveal about human adaptability and resilience. Our ancestors faced and survived dramatic environmental changes. When their homelands flooded, they relocated, adapted, invented new technologies, and thrived. When barriers appeared, they found ways around them. When familiar resources disappeared, they found new ones. This adaptability is humanity's greatest strength and has enabled our species to survive and prosper through climate changes that drove many other species extinct. As we face our own era of rapid environmental change, the lessons from vanished land bridges are particularly relevant. Our ancestors couldn't prevent the melting of ice age glaciers or hold back rising seas. What they could do and did with remarkable success was adapt, migrate, innovate, and survive. They watched their world transform over generations, losing lands that had been home for thousands of years, yet they persisted.